My father skipped my mother's funeral to travel with his mistress, thinking he had inherited everything. But they had no idea that my mother's final letter gave me the power to leave them with nothing, and I was about to use it. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The air in the funeral home was thick with the scent of lilies and stale grief. It was a suffocating perfume, one that clung to the dark wood of the pews and the heavy velvet of the curtains. I sat in the front row, a solitary figure in a sea of sympathetic faces, my own face a pale, numb mask. My mother, the vibrant, laughing woman who had taught me how to read, how to bake, how to be strong, was gone. A sudden, aggressive illness had stolen her from us in a matter of months, leaving a void so vast it felt like a physical part of me had been carved out. My hands, clasped tightly in my lap, were trembling, not just from sorrow, but from a cold, creeping anger that had begun to take root in the pit of my stomach. My father, Richard, was not here. He wasn't sitting beside me, holding my hand, sharing in the crushing weight of this loss. He wasn't in the building at all. My phone buzzed in my purse, a jarring intrusion in the somber quiet. I ignored it, assuming it was another well-meaning cousin sending their condolences. But it buzzed again, and then a third time, insistent. With a sigh, I discreetly pulled it out, shielding the screen with my hand. It was a text from my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister. "Rebecca, you need to see this. I am so sorry." Beneath the message was a link to a social media page. My brow furrowed. What could possibly be so important at this moment? With a sense of dread, I tapped the link. The page that loaded was a garish explosion of color and manufactured happiness. It belonged to a woman named Tiffany, a woman I knew only as my father's friend. Her profile picture was a heavily filtered selfie, all wide eyes and a practiced pout. But it wasn't her face that made the air leave my lungs in a painful rush. It was the most recent post, uploaded just 1 hour ago. It was a photo of her and my father. They were on a balcony, the brilliant blue of a tropical ocean stretching out behind them. My father had his arm wrapped around Tiffany's waist, a wide, carefree smile on his face, a smile I hadn't seen in years. Tiffany was holding a brightly colored drink, complete with a tiny umbrella, and was pressing a kiss to his cheek. They were both wearing resort wear, looking tanned and relaxed. The caption underneath read, "Finally getting away from all the stress. So blessed to have this man treat me to a much-needed escape to paradise. Living my best life # couple goals." I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the image. Stress. The stress he was escaping was the funeral of his wife of 40 years. Paradise? His paradise was thousands of miles away from the cold, somber room where his only daughter was sitting alone, preparing to say her final goodbye to her mother. The photo was time-stamped. It was taken while I was here, selecting the casket spray, listening to the funeral director's hushed, respectful tones. While I was drowning, he was sunbathing. The calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. It wasn't just an affair, this was a declaration. It was a desecration of my mother's memory, a public and deliberate act of supreme disrespect. The lilies in the room suddenly smelled like decay. The sympathetic glances from relatives now felt like pity for the abandoned daughter. A hot, bitter wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just grief anymore. It was something darker, colder. It was the beginning of a war I never wanted to fight, but now knew I had to win. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. The hours after the service passed in a blur of hollow condolences and empty platters of food back at my house. Aunt Carol had taken charge, her quiet efficiency a balm on my frayed nerves. She deflected the more intrusive questions from distant relatives and made sure I had a cup of tea in my hands at all times, even if I couldn't bring myself to drink it. By the time the last guest had departed, the sun had set, leaving the house steeped in an unnatural silence. It was the first time I was truly alone in the home I had grown up in, and the absence of my mother's presence was a palpable ache in every room. I walked through the quiet halls, my fingers trailing over the familiar furniture, each object a testament to a life well lived, a life now extinguished. It was in my mother's study, surrounded by her books and the faint scent of her favorite rose-scented perfume, that I finally allowed myself to act. I needed to hear his voice. I needed to hear him try to justify the unjustifiable. With a deep breath, I dialed his number. It rang once, twice, a third time before he picked up. The sound on his end wasn't the quiet hum of a hotel room. It was the faint tinkle of glasses and distant, upbeat music. "Rebecca, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with a false, tinny concern. "Is everything okay?" I repeated, my own voice dangerously low. "I'm not sure, Dad. Why don't you tell me? I just got home from Mom's funeral. You remember Mom, right?" There was a pause. I could hear him moving, the background noise softening as if he'd stepped away from the music. "Rebecca, listen," he began, his tone shifting to one of strained patience. "I know the timing is bad, I know that." "The timing isn't bad, Dad. The timing is monstrous," I shot back, the anger I'd been suppressing all day finally breaking through the dam of my grief. "You are on a beach somewhere with that woman while the love of your life, your wife of 4 decades, is being buried. How could you?" "It's complicated," he said, the classic coward's refrain. "Tiffany, she's been a great support to me through all of this. This trip was booked months ago. It was non-refundable. She thought it would be good for me to get away, to clear my head after everything." I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "A great support? Clearing your head? Did you clear your head of every memory you ever had with Mom? Did you clear it of every promise you ever made to her? The woman who stood by you when your first business failed, who nursed you through pneumonia, who raised your child. Her funeral was an inconvenience you needed to get away from." "You're being hysterical," he snapped, his defensiveness turning sharp. "Your mother and I, we hadn't been close for years. You know that. Life moves on. It's what she would have wanted." That was the line that shattered my last shred of composure. "Don't you dare," I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. "Don't you dare presume to know what she would have wanted. You have no idea. You forfeited that right a long, long time ago." I heard a muffled voice in the background, a woman's voice. "Tiffany." She was saying something to him, her tone coaxing. Then my father's voice came back on the line, colder than before. "Look, I'm sorry you're upset. I'll be back in a week and we can sort through the estate then. There are things to discuss. Try to get some rest." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stood there in the silent study, the dead phone pressed to my ear, the dial tone a mocking buzz. He wasn't just unremorseful, he was dismissive. He was already talking about the estate, about sorting through the material remnants of my mother's life as if she were a business transaction to be finalized. He and his support system had it all planned out. They thought they knew exactly how the next few weeks would unfold. They would return from their sun-drenched escape, and he would assume control of everything my mother had built, sharing it with the woman who had helped him betray her. A cold clarity washed over me, pushing the grief and anger into a tight, hard knot of resolve in my chest. They could have their week in paradise. They could laugh and drink and plan their future. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. They had forgotten who my mother truly was and just how carefully she had planned for this exact moment. My mother, Catherine, had been the quiet foundation of our family. My father was the charismatic salesman, the one with the big ideas and the booming laugh that could fill a room. But Mom was the architect. She was the one who managed the books for his early businesses, who turned his vague concepts into practical, profitable realities. She was the one who managed our home, our lives, with a steady, loving hand. When his company finally took off, Richard took all the credit, enjoying the fruits of his genius. My mother, ever humble, simply smiled and said she was happy he was happy. For years, I believed they were the perfect team. The last 2 years had been a slow, heartbreaking lesson in the truth. My mother's illness began subtly but progressed with ruthless speed. As she grew weaker, my father grew more distant. He was rarely home, citing important business trips and meetings that I now knew were flimsy excuses. I became her primary caregiver. I reduced my hours at my architecture firm, moved back into my childhood bedroom, and spent my days managing her medications, driving her to appointments, and simply sitting with her, holding her hand as she faded. It was in those quiet, stolen moments that she finally told me about Tiffany. She spoke without bitterness, her voice thin but steady. She described how Richard had become infatuated with this younger, glamorous woman who showered him with the attention he craved. Tiffany was a lifestyle consultant, a nebulous title for someone who seemed to spend most of her time shopping and attending galas on other people's dimes. My mother showed me Tiffany's social media profile once. The woman was all polished surfaces. Her photos were a curated gallery of expensive restaurants, designer clothes, and exotic locations. Her face, though beautiful, had a hard, acquisitive glint in her eyes. She often posted vague, inspirational quotes about manifesting your dreams and attracting abundance, which seemed to translate to finding a wealthy, older man to fund her lifestyle. What struck me most was her pointed interest in our family. I saw photos of her posing near my father's classic car, a gift from my mother on their 30th anniversary. There was another of her at the country club, with my parents' house vaguely visible in the background, captioned, "Dreaming of a view like this one day?" It was audacious, predatory. She wasn't just having an affair with my father, she was auditioning for my mother's life. My mother confessed that she had tried to talk to Richard to appeal to the decades of shared history between them. But he was lost in the fantasy Tiffany had spun for him, a world where he was still a vibrant, powerful man, not the aging husband of a terminally ill woman. "He's not a bad man, Rebecca," my mother had whispered, her hand cool in mine. "He's just weak, and she is very, very strong in her wants." It was a moment of incredible grace forgiving a man who was actively betraying her in her darkest hour. But my mother was more than just graceful, she was pragmatic. "Don't you worry about me," she'd said, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. "And don't you worry about your future. I've taken care of everything." At the time, I thought she meant she had made peace with her fate. I didn't realize she was talking about something far more tangible. She was talking about her final move in a game my father and his mistress didn't even know they were playing. Now, standing in her study, the memory of that conversation was a beacon of light in the darkness. My mother hadn't just been preparing for her death, she had been preparing to protect her legacy and to protect me. Tiffany's mistake wasn't just underestimating my mother's grace, it was underestimating her intelligence. The day after the funeral, I found the letter. It was tucked inside my mother's favorite copy of Pride and Prejudice, a place she knew only I would look. Her handwriting, usually so elegant, was shaky but resolute. She told me how much she loved me, how proud she was of the woman I had become, and then she laid out her plan. "Go see Mr. Henderson," she wrote. "He has the papers. He will explain everything. Your father has made his choices, and now he must live with them. You are the guardian of this family's heart now, Rebecca. Don't let them break it." Mr. Henderson had been our family lawyer for 30 years. He was a kind, stoic man with eyes that had seen every flavor of human drama. When I walked into his office, he greeted me with a sad smile and a firm handshake. He already knew why I was there. He slid a thick binder across his polished mahogany desk. "Your mother was a remarkable woman," he said, his voice gentle. "She was sharp as a tack, right up to the end. She foresaw this situation with perfect clarity." This was the moment my grief began to crystallize into resolve. I was no longer just a mourning daughter. I was the executor of my mother's will, the instrument of her final, brilliant strategy. I opened the binder. The legal jargon was dense, but Mr. Henderson walked me through it, page by page. It was a masterpiece of legal fortification. 6 months before she passed, my mother had quietly restructured her assets. The beautiful home I grew up in, her substantial investment portfolio, and all of her personal savings were not part of the standard marital estate anymore. They had been transferred into an irrevocable trust. My name, Rebecca, was listed as the sole beneficiary and, upon her death, the sole trustee. My father was named as a conditional resident of the house, meaning he could live there, but he held no ownership and could not sell it or borrow against it. But that wasn't the masterstroke. The true genius was in a small, carefully worded section Mr. Henderson referred to as the morality clause. The clause stated that Richard's right to reside in the home and receive a spousal allowance from the trust was contingent upon his behaving in a manner that showed due respect to the memory of his late wife for a period of 1 year following her death. Any action deemed a gross and public display of disrespect, as determined by the trustee, me, would be grounds for immediate termination of all his benefits under the trust. A vacation with his mistress during her funeral, Mr. Henderson said, peering at me over his spectacles. I believe that would qualify as a gross and public display of disrespect, wouldn't you agree? A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled in weeks. It was a trap, a beautiful, perfect ero-clad trap, and my father, led by the nose by his greedy mistress, had just skipped right into it. They thought they were coming home to liquidate my mother's life. They were actually coming home to be evicted from it. So what happens now? I asked, my voice steady and clear. That is entirely up to you, Rebecca, Mr. Henderson replied. You hold all the cards. You can enforce the clause immediately or you can wait. The power is yours. I closed the binder. The path forward was clear. I wouldn't be hysterical. I wouldn't scream or cry. I would be my mother's daughter. I would be calm, strategic, and unyielding. I would let them come home. I would let them walk into the house they believed was half theirs. I would let them reveal their true intentions. And then, when the moment was right, I would show them the true meaning of my mother's legacy. My investigation was over before it began. I didn't need a private investigator to find dirt on Tiffany. My mother had given me all the leverage I would ever need. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the targets to arrive. A week later, they returned. My father's call was brief, almost businesslike. We're back. I'll be home in an hour. We need to talk. The "we" was not lost on me. He wasn't coming alone. I spent the hour preparing, not by gathering documents or rehearsing speeches, but by centering myself. I made a pot of my mother's favorite Earl Grey tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my homework as a child, where my mother had bandaged my scraped knees. The house was quiet, a silent ally in the coming storm. I was the guardian of this home now, and I would not let them defile it. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep, calming breath before opening it. There they stood. My father, Richard, looking slightly sunburned and uncomfortable, avoiding my eyes, and beside him Tiffany, looking every bit the victor. She was dressed in an expensive-looking white linen pantsuit, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a large pair of designer sunglasses perched on her head. She offered me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Rebecca, it's so good to finally meet properly," she purred, extending a hand laden with rings. "Richard has told me so much about you. I'm so terribly sorry for your loss. Your mother was a wonderful woman, I'm sure." The insincerity was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. I ignored her outstretched hand and looked directly at my father. "Hello, Dad. Did you have a nice trip?" He flinched. "Rebecca, please, can we come in?" I stepped aside, holding the door open. They walked into the foyer, Tiffany's eyes immediately scanning the decor, the artwork on the walls, her gaze lingering on the grand staircase. She was assessing the property, mentally calculating its worth. It was sickeningly transparent. "Let's talk in the study," I said, leading them down the hall. Once we were seated, me behind my mother's mahogany desk, them in the 2 plush visitor chairs opposite me, my father cleared his throat. "Look," he began, "I know you're angry, but we need to be practical. There's a lot to handle with the estate. Tiffany has been helping me think about the future." "Oh," I said, my voice deceptively mild. "And what does the future look like?" Tiffany leaned forward, placing a proprietary hand on my father's arm. "What your father means is that this is a very large house for just one person," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "It holds so many memories, some of them probably very painful for him now. We were thinking it might be best to sell, to downsize. A fresh start for everyone." There it was, the opening salvo. They hadn't even waited a full day. "A fresh start," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "You've certainly put a lot of thought into my father's future, Tiffany, and my mother's home." "Richard and I are a team now," she said, her smile tightening. We just want what's best for him. I leaned back in the chair, my fingers steepled. I looked from her smug face to my father's conflicted one. He knew this was wrong, but he was too weak, too ensnared to protest. It was time to spring the first wire of the trap. "That's very considerate of you," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "But I'm afraid you're both operating under a slight misapprehension. You see, my mother made some very specific final arrangements for her property. Her plans for this house and for her assets were quite detailed." I saw a flicker of unease in Tiffany's eyes. She hadn't anticipated this. She had assumed my mother was a passive victim, not a strategic opponent. "What arrangements?" she asked, her voice a little sharper. "All in due time," I said with a serene smile. "But I can assure you, selling this house is not part of the plan, not my mother's plan anyway." My father looked confused, but Tiffany's mask of polite concern cracked. A flash of raw fury crossed her face before she could conce. "Alet, what are you talking about?" she snapped, her voice losing its sugary coating. "This house is as much Richard's as it was hers. He has rights." "Rights," I countered, my calm infuriating her further. "That's a very interesting subject. We should definitely talk about that." Her reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. By lashing out, by immediately asserting a claim, she had shown her hand. She wasn't here as a supportive partner, she was here as a gold digger, ready to stake her claim. She saw the house, the money, the life she wanted, and she was getting angry that a grieving daughter was standing in her way. My father just sat there, silent and useless, watching the exchange like a spectator at a tennis match. The confrontation had just begun, but I had already won the first point. The days that followed were a cold war fought within the walls of my own home. My father and Tiffany stayed, turning the guest wing into their personal headquarters. Tiffany flitted about the house as if she were its mistress, making comments about changing the curtains or how the garden needed a modern touch. She was trying to provoke me, to establish dominance, but I refused to take the bait. I treated her with a polite, impenetrable indifference that seemed to frustrate her more than any argument could. Meanwhile, my father avoided me, hiding behind Tiffany's lid. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the choices he had made. The pressure escalated when Tiffany began bringing real estate agents to the house for appraisals. She would parade them through the rooms, speaking in loud, confident tones about market values and potential buyers, all while I sat in the living room, calmly reading a book. The first two agents left looking confused after I politely informed them that the property was not, and would not be, for sale. This led to the second major confrontation. Tiffany stormed into the study where I was working, my father trailing hesitantly behind her. "You have to stop this, Rebecca," she demanded, her face flushed with anger. "You are sabotaging our future. Richard needs the capital from this house to invest in our new life." "Our new life?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what this is?" I turned my attention to my father. "Dad, is this what you want? To sell the home Mom loved, the home you built together, to fund her new business venture?" I gestured vaguely at Tiffany. My father had the decency to look ashamed. "It's not that simple, Rebecca." "It's perfectly simple," Tiffany interrupted, stepping in front of him. "Richard is grieving, he's not thinking clearly. He needs someone to look out for his best interests, and that's what I'm doing." I decided it was time to reveal the case I had been building. I opened a file on the desk, not the trust documents, not yet, but a different set of papers. "Speaking of best interests," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I had my lawyer do a little background research, Tiffany. It's amazing what you can find in public records. It seems you have a history of being a support system for wealthy, recently bereaved older gentlemen. There was a Mr. Abernathy in Palm Springs, an art dealer, and a Mr. Dubois in Aspen. Both ended with you receiving very generous gifts before you moved on. It's quite a pattern." Tiffany's face went white. She was utterly speechless. My father stared at her, a dawning horror in his eyes. He had believed he was special, that her affection for him was real. Seeing her history laid out in such a transactional, predatory pattern was a blow to his ego and his heart. "What is this?" he whispered, looking at the papers I held. This, I said, finally pulling the thick binder containing the trust from the drawer, is reality. I pushed it across the desk toward him. And this is my mother's final word on the matter. I opened it to the relevant page, the one containing the morality clause, and highlighted the key phrases with my finger. Gross and public display of disrespect to the memory of his late wife, I read aloud. As determined by the trustee, that's me. I let the words sink in. My father read the clause, his face paling with every word. He looked from the page to me, then to Tiffany, his expression a mixture of confusion, dread, and the first flicker of true understanding. "What does this mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tiffany, recovering from the shock, tried to regain control. "It's a trick. It's a legal trick. She's trying to cut you out, Richard. Don't listen to her," she hissed, her voice shrill with panic. "It means," I said, standing up and looking down at both of them, my voice filled with the cold authority my mother had bestowed upon me, "that your vacation, Dad, the one you took during Mom's funeral, was a very, very expensive mistake. It means this house isn't yours to sell. It means your allowance isn't guaranteed. It means your future is not in your hands or hers. It's in me." "Nay." The spell was broken. The image of Tiffany as his loving, supportive partner shattered, replaced by the reality of a desperate, cornered predator. My father looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, he saw the grasping greed behind the mask of affection. The foundation of their new life had just crumbled into dust. The final showdown came 2 nights later. Despite the revelation of the trust, Tiffany was not willing to retreat. She believed she could still manipulate my father, that his weakness and infatuation were stronger than my legal standing. In a last-ditch effort to solidify her position and isolate him from me, she insisted on hosting a small dinner party. She invited a few of their mutual friends, people who had known my mother for years but had been swayed by my father's narrative of a loveless marriage. Her goal was clear: to present herself and my father as a united, happy couple, making me look like the bitter, obstructionist daughter. It was a public relations move, and it was going to be her undoing. I wasn't invited, but I knew I had to be there. I arrived just as the main course was being served. I let myself in with my key and walked into the dining room. The chatter immediately died. 6 faces stared at me, a mixture of shock and discomfort. My father looked horrified. Tiffany, seated at the head of my mother's table, shot me a look of pure venom. "Rebecca," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "What a surprise. We weren't expecting you." "I'm sure you weren't," I replied calmly, my eyes sweeping over the guests. "Hello, everyone. I apologize for the interruption. I just have a small family matter to clear up. It won't take a moment." I walked to the empty chair at the other end of the table, my mother's chair, and remained standing. I placed a single manila folder on the table in front of me. "Dad," I said, my voice clear and steady, resonating in the silent room. "For the past week, Tiffany has been telling you that I am trying to steal your inheritance, that I am trying to punish you out of spite. She's wrong." I looked at Tiffany. "This isn't about punishment. It's about honoring my mother's final wishes. Something neither of you seemed concerned with when you were sunning yourselves in the tropics while she was being buried." A few of the guests gasped. They hadn't known the full extent of the betrayal. "That's a lie," Tiffany shrieked, jumping to her feet. "Richard needed to get away. I was helping him cope." "Were you helping him cope when you had real estate agents appraising this house less than a week after the funeral?" I countered, my voice never rising. "Were you helping him when you researched how to liquidate my mother's stock portfolio? Or were you simply trying to secure your next benefactor, just like you did with Mr. Abernathy and Mr. Dubois?" The color drained from her face. My father sank lower in his chair, his face buried in his hands. "I won't stand here and be insulted," Tiffany cried, looking around the table for support, but finding only shocked and judgmental stares. "You won't have to stand for much longer," I said. I opened the folder and took out a single sheet of paper. It was a formal notice, drafted by Mr. Henderson. "This is a legal document enforcing the morality clause of the Catherine Miller Trust. It states that due to a gross and public display of disrespect, namely, abandoning his wife's funeral for a leisure trip with his mistress, Richard Miller's residential rights to this property are hereby terminated, effective immediately. He has 30 days to vacate the premises. The silence in the room was absolute. Tiffany's jaw dropped. She stared at the paper as if it were a snake. "You can't do that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My mother did," I replied. "She knew her husband. She knew he was weak. And she knew that people like you would see him as an opportunity. This house, her assets, they are not his to give you. They belong to the trust, and I am the trustee. My mother protected her legacy, Dad, from you, from her." And then, the moment of truth. My father slowly lifted his head. The conflict in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, soul-crushing shame. He looked at Tiffany, at her panicked, greedy face, and then he looked at me, standing resolute in my mother's place. The fantasy was over. He finally saw. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his movements slow, like an old man. He walked over to Tiffany, not with anger, but with a weary finality. "Get out," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Get out of this house. Now." Tiffany stared at him, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Her power over him was gone. Defeated, humiliated in front of the very people she sought to impress, she grabbed her purse and fled the room without another word. The public showdown was over. My mother had won. In the aftermath of the disastrous dinner party, the house fell into a deep, echoing quiet. The guests had departed quickly, murmuring apologies, their allegiances clearly shifted. I was left alone in the dining room with my father. He stood by the window, his back to me, a silhouette against the dark night. He looked smaller, diminished. The bravado and defensive anger were gone, leaving only a hollowed-out shell of a man. "She's gone," he said, his voice thick. "She called a car, took her things." He turned to face me, and for the first time I saw the full weight of his grief, not for Tiffany, but for my mother. Tears were streaming down his face. "What have I done, Rebecca? Oh, Catherine, what have I done?" It was the opening my mother had hoped for. Not a victory for me, but a chance for him to find his way back. I walked over to him, not with triumph, but with a sorrow that mirrored his own. I didn't have to enforce the eviction. The clause had served its purpose. It had shattered the illusion and forced him to confront the truth. Over the next few weeks, my father and I began the slow, painful process of talking. He told me everything: how his loneliness during my mother's illness had made him vulnerable, how Tiffany's flattery had been a balm to his aging ego, and how he had allowed himself to be led so far astray from the man he once was. There were no excuses, only heartbreaking confessions. In turn, I told him about the quiet strength my mother had shown in her final months, and the immense pain his betrayal had caused. It was a difficult, messy, and necessary reconciliation. Tiffany tried to fight back, of course. Her lawyer sent a letter demanding a share of my father's expected inheritance, claiming emotional distress and breach of promise. Mr. Henderson responded with a single package containing copies of the trust documents and the research into her past relationships. We never heard from her again. Her reputation among the social circle she so desperately wanted to conquer was ruined. She had lost her prize and her credibility in one spectacular, public flameout. My father, humbled and repentant, agreed to all of my mother's terms without contest. He moved out of the main house and into the small guest cottage on the property, a solution we both felt honored the spirit of the trust. He was still in his home, but the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. I, as trustee, managed the estate, ensuring my mother's legacy was used for good, donating to the charities she had supported and setting up an educational fund in her name. The house, once a battleground, slowly became a home again. The silence was no longer heavy with tension, but filled with the quiet comfort of healing. My father and I found a new, more honest relationship, one built not on old habits, but on a shared loss and a mutual respect for the woman who had, even from the grave, managed to save us both. Her clever trap had not been an act of revenge, it had been an act of love. It was a way to protect her daughter, and to give her husband one last chance at redemption. In the end, her resolution was perfect, leaving me not with the bitter taste of victory, but with the quiet, profound peace of justice served, and a family, however broken, on the path to being whole again.